Our next step is to think about our entity relationship diagram. We could do a domain model class diagram, and as you've seen in the textbook and also your work, the domain model class diagram is very similar to the entity relationship diagram. It does have classes in it, which we don't go into in this unit, but so we're going to look at the entity relationship diagram, and you can translate that to the domain model class diagram. Okay, so if we think about the things in this system that we might need to keep track of, probably we're going to need to keep track of customers. I think that's a fairly straightforward one. So I'm just going to write these up in the corner for the moment. So I'm just going to drag this text over here. I'm going to put customer is one thing. We might want to keep track of staff, so we can track who's actually serving who and who's being very productive and who's not. We might want to track the purchases that they're doing. So a purchase might be buying 10 60-cent stamps. We might want to keep track of a post office box. Now, I'm really not going to go into a lot of detail in this entity relationship diagram. I'm just going to look at something very simple, and what you can do is do something similar and continue this on. So it really depends on the case study, it depends on how you've worked out what you want. So I'm just going to look at these 4 entities to start with, and then we may add an entity if we need to. Okay, so the first thing that we need is our entity relationship diagram shapes. So let's go to our shapes, and you can see there's entity relationship here. So let's save that. Now I'm going to just use the most simple entity relationship, entity shapes, which is just this one, and I'm going to put in here customer. Now, remembering that we name entities with all capitals, and I'm going to put staff over here. And then what else have we got? We've got purchases. Well, I think that customers are going to have something to do with purchases, aren't they? So that's a purchase. And we've also got post office boxes. So let's have post office boxes here. Actually, what we might do, and this is the really good thing about using Lucidchart rather than trying to draw it in some other just trying to draw it manually, is that we can move some of these around. So what I might do is put post office box up here, PO box, and staff. Okay, so we're saying that the customer is relating to staff, the customer is also relating to a PO box, and the customer is relating to purchases. Okay, let's start relating these now. Let's relate the customer to the post office box. So we're going to draw a connection. Remember, it just sets something up for us. It doesn't really matter what it is. And so I'm going to actually turn these off so they're not going to distract us. I might make them just 1-to-1 to start with, just so that we don't get distracted. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to start at each entity and then look at the other entity and see how it relates. So each customer can have 0 post office boxes, 1 post office box, or multiple post office boxes. So this end, so each customer can have 0, 1, or many post office boxes. So this end of it, which I believe was this, should be 0, oops, no it isn't, it's the other end. I chose the wrong one. 0 or many, okay? Now each post office box is registered by One customer? Yes, that's true. But what about a post office box that isn't actually being registered by a customer at this moment? So we can actually have post office boxes that are not registered. So let's make this a 0 or 1. Okay, so this is our first relationship. Now, let's look at our next relationship, which is the customers and the staff. So the customer is served by a staff member, and a staff member serves a customer. Okay, so let's connect these up. Connect it up. Now, each customer can be served by how many staff? Well, each time you go into a post office box, you could be served by a different staff member, yes? So they can actually be served by one or many staff. If they're a customer, then they're actually buying something or whatever. So it's not an optional relationship. So this is going to be one or many. And then each staff member can serve 0, 1 or many customers. So we can make this 0, 1 or many. Okay, now Houston, we have a problem. We've got a many-to-many relationship. Whenever you've got a many-to-many relationship, then you need to change it in some way, because you can't actually use this to create a database. You can't have a many-to-many relationship in a relational database. So what we need to do is to add another entity, and this other entity is the transaction that's happening between the customer and the staff on a particular day at a particular time. So let's add in another entity, and we're going to call this one transaction. Okay, and we're going to get rid of this, and we're going to connect up our customer with our transaction, and we're also going to connect our staff with our transaction. And now we need to work out what is the cardinality of these. So each customer can have one or many transactions. So they have to have at least one, because otherwise they're not a customer. But each transaction, and I'm going to put in some of the fields that you might have here. So things like date, time, invoice number, etc. So each of these, each transaction is going to happen, is only going to be associated with one customer. That's right, isn't it? One customer. Okay, so that's one and only one, and it has to be associated with a customer, because you can't have a transaction without a customer there. Okay, so now let's look at staff. So each staff member can be involved with 0 if they're new, 1 or many transactions. So let's make this 0 or many. Okay. You can have a staff member, unlike a customer doesn't become a customer until they've actually had a transaction. But a staff member, you can actually employ a staff member without having them actually having sold anything yet. So that's why it's optional. But each transaction involves one and only one staff member. So somewhere in this transaction entity, we're going to have a staff ID or something like that. Okay, so now we've got our transaction. Let's just put in some of these fields. So we might have a staff ID, we might have a first name, we might have a last name. Normally you'd actually not have spaces, so I'll just remove that space. The customer might be customer ID, and their first name and their last name, and it maybe have other things in it as well, like their address, depending upon what information you need about your customer. And in the same way, what information you need about the staff member, there may be more information about the transaction as well. Now, you may be wondering, how is this different than purchase? Well, purchase is something that belongs on a transaction. So if you like, you can think of it as an actual line of the transaction. So something like 10 stamps or post office box rental or something like that. Okay, so our purchase actually relates to our transaction rather than relating to the customer. Okay, so we can put this down here, and each transaction can have at least one, because otherwise it's not a transaction, but it can have many purchases on it. Okay, so let's make it one or many. Each purchase belongs to just one transaction, and it doesn't belong, it can't belong to anything by itself. So that's right. Okay, so we've now got the beginnings of an entity relationship diagram. Of course, what we would want to do is actually put in some other things here. We're going to make it useful. PO box number, etc., etc. Might have some other capacity, might have some other details in there. And this PO box number will probably be the primary key of this PO box entity. Customer ID will probably be the primary key of the customer entity. Staff ID will be the primary key of the staff entity. Now, let's look at what will be the primary key of the transaction entity. Now, because it is an associative entity, okay, we made it to relate these two, what we can do is add staff ID and customer ID to this transaction. Now, if you weren't sure about this, if you had just come up with transaction, you hadn't taken that many-to-many step to start with, you will find that even if you do it that way, whenever there's a one-to-many relationship, what you do is you take the primary key out of the one side and put it into the many side. So this will always end up with a customer ID. The same with the staff. It takes out of the one side and puts it into the many side. So this is staff ID. Now, it just happens that both of these are foreign keys, because they are a primary key that's been put in here, but they're also a part of the primary key. So they're the primary key for this one, this entity, but they're a foreign key because they actually belong to another entity. This will become more obvious as you do the data management unit. Okay, and the same way, purchase ID, purchase ID will be the primary key for this. And then you'll see that because it's got a one-to-many, both customer ID and staff ID will be on the purchase. Okay, because it's that one-to-many. So you can see that each purchase, it will be related to customer and staff anyway. In the same way, this one-to-many, post office box, will have a customer ID, which will be the foreign key in that table once we make a database from it. So we might have a rented yes, no field. We may have other fields in there as well. But you can see that what this does is we can look at this post office box. It's going to give us a customer ID, which is just a number, but that's like a shortcut to all the details about that particular customer. So when we've got the PO box number, we can actually look up all the other information. This is a very simple entity relationship diagram. You don't have to put that down like that. You can actually bring it up here I'm just bringing it down to show you. But you can see that this entity relationship diagram is pretty simple, and yet it's going to store quite a lot of information about our system. Now, our next step is to do a system sequence diagram, and that relates to the use cases. So we're going to have a look at that one next.